Imagine this. A state pours in a sum equal to an entire country's annual budget, builds thousands of kilometers of roads, digs foundation pits for nuclear power plants, and constructs canals half the length of Europe, and then it simply stops. Workers walk away from construction sites. Machinery rusts exactly where it stood, and towns built for tens of thousands of workers empty out within a few years. This isn't a post-apocalyptic movie or a game script. This is the real history of Soviet megaprojects. Projects meant to redraw the map of the world that instead became the most expensive monuments in history to unfulfilled ambition. And the most surprising part is that there weren't just a few of these projects. There were dozens. Railways leading nowhere, nuclear plants finished to 80%, canals capable of altering the climate of entire regions, and even subway systems that were built and then forgotten. Today we'll dig into why the most powerful construction machine in human history suddenly started leaving nothing behind but ruins, and what's happening at these places right now. To understand why this happened, you first need to understand the psychology of Soviet planning. The USSR didn't build for today. It built for a bright future that was supposedly just around the corner. Every 5-year plan set a goal not merely to meet its targets, but to exceed them. This created a culture of gigantism. If you could build a factory, why not build the biggest factory in the world? If you needed a railway, why not build a second Trans-Siberian? If you needed a power plant, why not the most powerful one in Europe? Scale itself was an ideological weapon. Every megaproject was proof of socialism's superiority over capitalism, proof that a planned economy could overcome any challenge nature threw at it. That's why the decisions to launch these projects were often made not by engineers or economists, but by political leadership, sometimes literally by the General Secretary personally. The problem is that these decisions were made from the top down, often without any real economic justification, and funding depended on political conditions rather than actual need. And those conditions kept shifting, especially sharply after 1985, when perestroika began, and then again after 1991, when the Union collapsed entirely. When the political will disappeared, so did the funding. Projects simply froze. No money, no completion, and often no explanation at all for the people who had already moved there to live and work, who had invested years of their lives into it. And it's worth noting this wasn't unique to any one industry. The same pattern shows up in railways, nuclear energy, water management, urban transit, and heavy industry, which is exactly why this video covers several categories rather than just one. Once you see the pattern in one project, you start recognizing it everywhere across the map of the former Union. Let's start with the most ambitious and best known example, the Baikal-Amur main line, 4,300 kilometers of railway cutting through impenetrable taiga, permafrost, and seismically active zones of Siberia and the Russian Far East. For comparison, that's farther than the distance from London to Baghdad. The idea first emerged back in the 1930s as a strategic alternative to the Trans-Siberian Railway, a backup in case of war with Japan or China, when the main line, running close to the border, could be cut off. The first survey expeditions, and even a few isolated sections of track, were actually built by Gulag prisoners back in the 1930s and 40s, a separate, very dark chapter of BAM's history that official propaganda later preferred not to mention. But large-scale construction in the form most people remember only began in 1974 and was proudly declared an all-Union Komsomol shock construction project. Hundreds of thousands of young enthusiasts flocked here from across the Union, from Ukraine, the Baltics, the Caucasus, Central Asia. The romance of taming Siberia boosted wages with northern bonuses and promises of an apartment without decades of waiting all worked as a powerful magnet for young people who otherwise faced endless housing queues. According to official propaganda, BM would open access to colossal mineral deposits, copper, coal, gold, iron ore, and become the economic engine of the entire region for a century to come. First, the cost. The initial estimates of tens of billions of Soviet rubles turned out to be catastrophically low. Building in permafrost conditions, where the ground literally floats, depending on the season and temperature, required technology and materials the USSR simply didn't have in sufficient quantity at the time. The Severomysky Tunnel, one of the most difficult sections of the main line, 15 kilometers long, took more than 25 years to build because of complex geology, underground quicksand, and constant cave-ins. While the tunnel was being finished, trains were forced for years to take a temporary surface detour around the mountain, adding hours to every trip. Second, the economic justification turned out to be far weaker than promised. The industrial plants and mining complexes meant to bring the region to life along the railway were never built at anywhere near the planned scale. As a result, the main line earned an unofficial but very fitting nickname, the Road to Nowhere. It physically connected points that, at the time of launch, didn't have enough freight traffic to justify the enormous cost of maintaining it. When the Union collapsed in 1991, funding vanished instantly and completely. Dozens of construction workers' settlements, designed for thousands of families to live in permanently, complete with kindergartens, schools, and community centers, began emptying out within just a few years. People who had come to stay for life moved back en masse to the European part of the former Union, often with no money, no jobs, and no housing, despite the promises they'd once been given. It's worth mentioning another, less famous but even more dramatic project built on the same scale of thinking, the Transpolar Main Line, popularly nicknamed the Dead Road. This was a railway from Salekhard to Agarka, above the Arctic Circle, built by prisoners of Stalin-era labor camps between 1947 and 1953, largely by hand, in extreme cold. Construction was halted by a single decree almost immediately after Stalin's death, and everything was simply abandoned as it stood. Locomotives, barracks, rails left, right, in the tundra. The railway never fully entered operation, and its remains still lie in the tundra today as one of the most haunting yet visually striking abandoned sites in the world. The BM itself gets most of the attention, but few people talk about its planned branch lines, smaller offshoots meant to connect the main route to mineral deposits and regional capitals. The most ambitious of these was a line intended to reach Yakutsk, the capital of the Sakha Republic, opening up one of the richest and most remote mineral regions on the planet. Construction dragged on in fits and starts for decades, funding arriving in small, unpredictable bursts depending on the state budget of the moment. The line technically reached the outskirts of Yakutsk only in the 2010s. Nearly 40 years after the original plan called for it, and even then, without a bridge across the Lena River, so the final station still sits on the wrong bank, a ferry ride away from the city it was supposed to serve. The main line was formally completed and is still operating today, carrying coal, ore, and other freight. But its full potential wasn't realized until decades later, once Russia began actively developing exports toward Asia, finally making the line economically justified. Secondary branches and stations remained unfinished, and the abandoned construction workers' settlements still stand today, half-ruined monuments to that era. now a popular destination for industrial tourism and photographers. There's also a quieter, more human side to this story. Many of the people who came as young idealists spent the best years of their lives in temporary housing that was supposed to last 5 years and ended up lasting 20. Some never got the apartments they were promised at all. The housing fund meant for them was quietly reallocated once the union's finances collapsed. Talk to people who worked on BAM today, and you'll often hear a strange mix of genuine pride in what they built and quiet bitterness about what they were promised and never received. If BM is a story of underestimated scale, unfinished nuclear power plants are a story of a dream cut short overnight. Literally, in a single night in April 1986. In the steppe near Shyokayan in Crimea, one of the Union's most powerful nuclear plants was meant to rise. Two reactor units capable of powering the entire peninsula for decades and eliminating its energy shortage once and for all. Construction began in 1975, and by 1986 the plant was more than half finished, with the town of Shyokayan, built for its future staff, already actively being settled. The April 1986 disaster at the Chernobyl nuclear plant instantly and irreversibly changed both public and government attitudes toward nuclear energy. The project was officially frozen in 1987, nominally due to a review of the USSR's nuclear energy program, but in reality because of massive public opposition and an entirely understandable fear of a repeat disaster right on a coastline where millions of people vacationed every year. The most tragic detail of this story: the plant was mothballed when it was nearly 80% complete. Reactor equipment, already partly installed and enormously expensive, sat idle for years without proper preservation, gradually deteriorating right where it stood. The town of Shyokayan, built specifically for plant staff with a projected population of 30,000, remained half empty. Typical Soviet apartment blocks stand in the steppe, settled at a fraction of the plant scale. In the 2000s, parts of the plant itself were dismantled for scrap metal, and at various points the reactor building was used as a nightclub and a rave venue, a rather surreal fact that always surprises viewers. Today, the complex is a popular destination for urban explorers and photographers shooting Soviet post-apocalyptic imagery, and photos of the giant empty cooling towers standing in the steppe regularly circulate on social media, but a similar fate befell other plants scattered across the Union. The Tatar nuclear power plant near Kamsky Polyony began construction in 1980 and was halted in 1990 due to the same post-Chernobyl syndrome, plus a lack of funding as the now independent Russia struggled economically. Completion at the time of the halt stood at over 30%. The town of Kamsky Polyony, built for the staff, still exists today, but living a very different life than planned. The plant itself remained an unfinished shell. The Kostroma nuclear power plant was meant to become the most powerful nuclear plant in Europe, an ambition typical of Soviet thinking about being the biggest in the world. Construction began in 1981 and stopped in 1988, again due to a combination of post-Chernobyl public pressure and mounting economic crisis. Today, all that remains at the site are foundations and overgrown construction sites in the Kostroma forests. Another lesser-known but telling example is the Voronezh nuclear heating station, intended to heat an entire city. Construction was stopped in 1990, already at a final stage, due to the same protests and fear of a Chernobyl-style scenario happening right in the heart of a major city. Some of the already completed structures were later even considered for repurposing, but for the most part the facility remains abandoned. Yet another example: and perhaps the most extreme in terms of how quickly public sentiment could kill a nearly finished project, the Bashkir nuclear power plant near the city of Agidal. Construction had reached an advanced stage by the late 1980s, with a workforce numbering in the thousands and an entire purpose-built town already housing plant employees. Local protests, fueled directly by the still-fresh trauma of Chernobyl, escalated so quickly and so intensely that authorities halted construction almost overnight in 1990. Agidal, the town built for the plant's staff, still exists. But instead of becoming a thriving nuclear industry hub, it became one of the smallest and most economically isolated towns in the entire region, its population far below what was originally planned. What's striking when you line these stories up side by side is the sheer scale of sunk cost. By some estimates, the combined value of unfinished Soviet nuclear infrastructure, steel, concrete, specialized equipment, engineering hours, would be worth many billions of dollars in today's money. Almost none of it ever produced a single watt of electricity. In all these cases, the same pattern repeats. Enormous investment, completion rates ranging from 30 to 80%, and then a sudden halt caused by a shift in the political and public climate, one that planners simply could not have foreseen when the projects were launched. Nuclear plants are about energy. Now let's look at an even more ambitious category of projects, ones meant to literally redraw the geography and climate of entire regions. A megaproject to divert part of the Volga's flow into the arid regions of Kalmykia and Dagestan through a canal over 900 kilometers long. The idea was simple. The steppes lacked water, while the Volga carried far too much of it straight into the Caspian Sea. So why not redirect part of that flow? Construction began in the second half of the 1980s, and a significant portion of the route was actually dug. But for the first time in the late USSR, mass environmental protests, a rare form of organized public dissent at that point, played a decisive role. Scientists and local residents warned of catastrophic consequences for the Volga's ecosystem and the Caspian Sea. Combined with the approaching collapse of the USSR, this public pressure finally buried the project around 1990, an even more ambitious, almost science fiction level project, reversing the flow of the great Siberian rivers, the Ob and the Irtysh, southward, to bring water to the arid regions of Central Asia and, as its proponents claimed, save the Aral Sea, which was already beginning to catastrophically shrink due to excessive water extraction for cotton fields. This project was developed over decades, and it wasn't some fringe fantasy. Entire research institutes worked on it, spending colossal resources designing canals thousands of kilometers long. But in August 1986, just months after Chernobyl, the Politburo unexpectedly canceled the entire program, to the surprise of many officials, partly due to scientists' warnings about unpredictable climate consequences of such intervention, and partly due to the almost unimaginable cost of implementation. Interestingly, the Aral Sea, which this project supposedly was meant to save, kept shrinking anyway without this intervention, and today it's one of the world's most famous environmental disasters, with abandoned ships sitting in the desert where a sea used to be. Not every stalled Soviet megaproject stayed frozen forever, and the Rogun Dam in Tajikistan is one of the more remarkable exceptions. Construction on what was meant to become one of the tallest dams in the world began in 1976, aiming to power an enormous aluminum industry across Central Asia. Progress was already slow due to the sheer technical difficulty of the site before a massive flood in 1993, during the chaos of the early post-Soviet period and Tajikistan's civil war, badly damaged the partially built structure and washed away years of work. For nearly 2 decades afterward, Rogun sat as a half-finished, flood-damaged shell, a symbol of a promise nobody could afford to keep. Only in the 2010s, once Tajikistan started attracting fresh international financing and rebuilt political will, did construction resume in earnest. The first turbine finally started generating electricity in 2018, over 40 years after the project began. It's a rare reminder that unfinished doesn't always mean unfinishable. Sometimes it just means waiting for the right decade. Beyond railways, nuclear plants, and canals, there's a whole other category of smaller, but no less telling unfinished projects that eye in several Soviet cities, including some regional centers with populations close to 1 million. Subway construction began in anticipation of reaching millionaire city status in the near future. When union-level funding disappeared, and some cities' populations never reached the expected numbers, the tunnels were simply mothballed, sometimes for decades. Some of these unfinished subways remain incomplete to this day, with kilometers of tunnels underneath these cities that no train has ever passed through. Few people know that the idea of a bridge across the Kerch Strait isn't new at all. The first attempt to build a crossing was made back in 1944, right after Crimea's liberation. A hastily built railway bridge stood for only a few months before being destroyed by ice that same winter. Reviving the idea at a full Soviet scale was discussed for decades afterward, but it was never actually realized until an entirely different historical era that a separate category consists of enormous industrial complexes built to serve a specific political goal or an ambitious 5-year plan, which then never operated at full capacity due to shifting economic conditions. The collapse of cooperative supply chains between republics after 1991, or simply a lack of demand for the products they were meant to produce. Some of these plants were built to produce highly specialized components that only made sense within the tightly integrated Soviet supply chain. The moment the republics that supplied their raw materials or bought their output became separate countries overnight, entire factory complexes lost their reason to exist almost instantly, despite being physically complete. Beyond individual factories, entire planned settlements in the Arctic and far north never grew beyond a skeleton of their intended size. Soviet planners routinely projected populations for new northern towns based on resource extraction quotas that assumed decades of stable, expanding production. When extraction plans were later scaled back or abandoned, some of these towns stopped growing halfway through construction, leaving behind a strange mix of finished apartment blocks standing right next to permanently unfinished ones, as if a town had been paused mid-sentence. What unites literally all of these stories is this: decisions were made under the assumption of endless resources and unchanging political will. When both of those assumptions turned out to be false, the state collapsed, the money ran out, priorities shifted dramatically. The megaprojects remained frozen for decades, and sometimes forever. These megaprojects aren't just curious trivia for abandoned places enthusiasts. They're a lesson in what happens when a project scale outgrows a system's ability to see it through. The Soviet Union proved, through its own experience, that you can throw thousands of workers, billions of rubles, and the best engineering talent of the era at a construction project. But without stable funding, realistic economic justification, and a buffer for crisis, even the most ambitious plan turns into a concrete ghost standing in the middle of a steppe, a forest, or the tundra. Interestingly, some of these projects did get resurrected in new forms in other countries and other eras. BM is now being actively modernized and expanded. Rogun eventually got finished, And some unfinished nuclear plants are being considered as sites for entirely new energy projects. History doesn't always end in permanent ruin. Sometimes it's just a very long pause, one that can last for decades. What ties every single one of these stories together, from the tundra of the dead road to the concrete shells of unfinished reactors, is a single, very human lesson. Ambition without a realistic plan for sustaining it doesn't just risk failure. It risks leaving physical scars on the landscape and on the lives of everyone who believed in the promise enough to show up and start building it. If you enjoyed stories like this about ambitious projects that didn't go according to plan, hit like. It really helps the channel reach a wider audience. And in the comments, let me know which megaproject, Soviet or from anywhere else in the world, you'd like to see covered next. Your idea might just become the topic of the next video. See you in the next one.